Hello everyone, my name is Patrick Tor and welcome to my video. Today we will be discussing Beowulf, specifically the second fight in the poem, in which he fights against Grendel's mother. First, I will be giving a brief synopsis of the poem, that way we all understand what's happening, and afterwards we will be talking about the symbolism present, that way we can better understand what the poem is actually trying to communicate to us. Now, before the second fight begins, we need to know that Beowulf has just bested Grendel in hand-to-hand combat. And so, in retaliation, Grendel's mother then storms the hall herself at night and ends up not only kidnapping but also murdering the king's advisor upon returning to her lair. In retaliation to this, Beowulf assembles a team and goes to the lair to kill Grendel's mother. And before going underwater alone, Beowulf naturally adorns his armor, but it's also made note that he has a sword with him given to him by King Hrothgar named Hrunting. And the reason why this is important is because the sword is described as never failing the hand of anyone who has brought it into combat. So clearly, this is a sword with a very established history, one that's very powerful, one that ought to be brought into combat. And so Beowulf plunges into the water alone, and from what I understand, Grendel's mother's lair is said to have been not only underwater, but also kind of in a cave. So imagine like a subterranean water layer. You go into the cave, and in that cave is the water. And from that point, they begin to engage in combat, and Beowulf sees an opportunity to behead Grendel with Hrunting, and the sword ends up failing. Despite its history being pointed out to us, it did not serve what it intended to do. And so naturally, the sword is abandoned, and Beowulf uses his hands, what ended up being sufficient in fighting Grendel. Not sufficient against Grendel's mother, though. He actually almost ends up dying had his armor not been able to fend off one of her attacks. And then from that point, he ends up seeing in the corner of his eye a sword forged by the giant in Grendel's mother's armory. A massive sword that only Beowulf can use due to his heroic strength. And so Beowulf ends up acquiring the sword in the midst of combat, and that sword is what ends up allowing Beowulf to behead Grendel's mother. And upon beheading Grendel's mother, her blood actually ends up melting the blade of the sword. It leaves the hilt intact, but the blade is gone. And so, before returning to the king, Beowulf assembles not only the hilt of the sword to return to the king, but also Grendel's head. And this is pointed out because in the first fight against Grendel, it's not clear to Beowulf um, that Grendel is dead, and this is because Grendel ends up losing his arm and shoulder in combat, and then goes back to the swamp and kind of dies there. So we understand that from a reader's point of view that Grendel is like he's out of here, but they don't. And so the fact that he's bringing back Grendel's head is just, proof that he sealed the deal the first time. And, Grendel had been terrorizing this great hall for such a long time that it's like, yeah, we need to get rid of this guy, definitely. And so Beowulf ends up bringing back not only Grendel's head, but also the hilt of the sword to King Hrothgar. And it's made note of that the king sees on the hilt of the sword runes engraved into it that tell the story of the giants, their battle with God, and the great flood that occurred as a result of this. Now, before we get into a proper breakdown of the symbolism that's more concrete, I just want to throw out my own personal theory about something. It's super cool, but not fleshed out by any means, so this is not going to be conclusive. It's just something to chew on, so to speak. And what that is that first we need to know in the poem, Grendel's lineage and predecessors are all described as children of Cain, naturally being a reference to the story of Cain and Abel in Genesis. And in that story, it's made note that whoever harms Cain will be met with revenge sevenfold. And so, if we apply this idea to Beowulf now, Grendel has just been defeated in combat and killed. And as revenge, Grendel's mother ends up kidnapping and killing the king's advisor. And the reason why I think this is important is because when we're thinking about the idea of revenge, we're not just thinking about numbers necessarily. There's a value judgment attached to that. Because even though we all have our own unique values, some people have greater responsibilities, greater things to contribute. And so, upon killing Grendel, the king's advisor is what's targeted. Someone who is very close to the king, someone who has a wisdom and knowledge that the king can reasonably rely upon. And that's kind of that's that's kind of all I got for that idea. I think it's kind of cool, but it's it's subtly bringing in that idea of the value attached to revenge and how that breaks down. Next, we're going to be talking about a symbol that is so pervasive that even if you haven't consciously thought about it, I'm sure you'll understand this quite quickly. And what that is what water represents in literature. And what it usually represents is potential, chaos, and the unknown, that trifecta. And that can be expressed in different different proportions. And in the case of Beowulf, naturally he has to go underwater to fight Grendel's mother, submerging himself not only into the unknown but also into that chaos that is more primordial than Grendel. Right, the closer you get to the origin of something, the stronger um, its essences, so to speak, right? We talked about the children of Cain before. The closer up you get to Cain, the more you're, um, the more you're imbibed with that kind of value. Now, the proof that going under the water truly does imbibe that energy, being a child of Cain, we can recognize that because Grendel himself is relegated to the swamps, but not necessarily underneath the water, right? Grendel, he's an outcast, a child of Cain, already relegated to the fringe. And, he's already recognized as a menace to the Hall, right? He's been terrorizing them for God knows how long, killing all of the king's people. However, Grendel's mother takes that to another level. She's not only in the swamp, she's beneath the water in a cave in the swamp. She's even deeper entrenched in that energy. And this can be partially recognized by the fact that not only is she stronger than Grendel, but also even in her attacks, they're much more damning, so to speak, to the victims, right? She kills the king's advisor. And to state the obvious that we've just been kind of like glossing over almost, even though we've been saying it this entire video, Grendel's mother is the genesis of Grendel. That's how mothership works. And so all this terror that's been inflicted is partially just because, like, hey, like, I'm the reason for this being existing. Now, in the midst of this chaos and potential swirling about in Beowulf's fight against Grendel's mother, that's exactly where he finds like his next sword, the giant sword, the one that ends up being an aid to him in combat. But before we even get to that, let's talk about affronting the sword given to him by King Hrothgar. I think what this sword demonstrates is prior experience, wisdom from our predecessors that doesn't necessarily connect to the highest order of things, right? It may be sufficient for lower order problems we're dealing with, but it isn't sufficient to deal with something even more primordial, right? So once again, we're coming back to this idea of the fact that Grendel's mother is closer to Cain, closer to this ancient, almost persistent problem for humanity for all this time, right? We're talking about the problem of Cain slaying his kin. That's that's from Genesis. That's from all the way back. She's closer to that than Hrunting is. Hrunting being the sword of Beowulf's recent predecessors. It isn't as it is it said it is an ancient blade, but it doesn't really go back as to doesn't state how far back it goes. So I'm taking that as it's older than Beowulf, naturally, but it isn't something that really shoots all the way back like the way the giant sword does. And so Fronting, is this sword that, even though it's sufficient for his recent history, these previous kings, it isn't a tool that is adequate for this more primordial evil, this primordial problem. And once again, that's what Grendel's mother represents. And so that's why in her armory, that's where we see this giant sword, the sword that tells the tale of the giants and their combat against God, the flood, this deep history. And this is the sword that is adequately able to deal with this evil of Cain. And now to go back to our start of this particular topic, in the midst of this chaos, in facing this primordial evil head on, that's where Beowulf then sees the appropriate tools with him. That's where he sees the ancient giant's blade, the one that tells the details of the giants, the one that explains their battle with God and the resulting flood as a consequence. That's in the midst of that chaos, that's where the potential lies. That's where he's able to find this strength in the midst of the unknown against that evil. And remember, it's not just the sword strength, it's also Beowulf being able to recognize the value of that blade and how that's able to be used to achieve the proper goal of slaying this evil. And when it comes to recognizing the value of something, part of that involves recognizing that the ends to which it will be used and how you align yourself with that. And that's kind of where I'm getting at, where with Beowulf recognizing the value of this blade, that's what allows him to align himself with this more, I'm going to say, primordial, greater truth, so to speak. And how by aligning himself with that, he's able to conquer this more sinister, deeply rooted evil, which is, once again, to restate, represented by Enable in Genesis, slaying your kin. Like, big no, so to speak. I can't state that enough. That's that idea of not being your brother's slayer is a theme that's persistent throughout Beowulf. At the end of the story, Beowulf is at his deathbed, and he's talking about his life and his virtues and so on. And the main takeaway from that is that he says, I did what I could, and I wasn't my brother's slayer. You know, he made sure to take care of those who he associated with, those his kin, so to speak. And by aligning himself with that, that's what allows him to conquer the ones who did slay their kin. And by aligning himself with that, that's what allows him to see the full extent of what virtue is able to do in the face of vice. And with that, those were the big symbols and themes that I noticed in the story of Beowulf against Grendel's mother. If you have read Beowulf before, hopefully this increases your appreciation for the second fight. And if you haven't read Beowulf before, I implore you to do so. There are so many versions out there, but I happen to have grabbed this here Seamus Haney version. I have no real dog in the fight as to which translation you should read. There are people on Reddit who say otherwise. So if you want to figure out which one you should read, I'll leave that up to you. But that was the version I read. I thoroughly enjoyed it. And once again, if you have read Beowulf, leave a comment to let me know if you agree with my assessment. If you haven't read it but will, come back to it, let me know what you think. Thank you for watching.